Before we begin, I have one quick favor to ask. If you enjoy listening to these stories and updates, please subscribe. A surprising number of you watch regularly but haven't joined us yet, and that one click genuinely helps us keep making them. Because Broad Peak is no longer only the story of an avalanche, it's becoming a story about what happens afterward, when everybody else goes home and somebody still has to go back up. We will be providing an eyewitness account for the recovery of Sohail Sakhi's body later in the talk with accurate human translation of the language. Let's begin. For 13 days, Broad Peak kept Sohail Sakhi, the Hunza Valley native, after the treacherous avalanche on July 30th, 2026. Search teams found his backpack. They found his GPS tracker. They searched avalanche debris hundreds of meters below the place where 10 climbers had disappeared. Drones flew over the mountain. Experienced climbers entered gullies filled with unstable snow. Abid Bag and Sarbaz Khan went looking for Sohail, and another avalanche nearly killed them. It came roaring through the same debris field. They ran for the rocks. Abid escaped, but his backpack disappeared. His phone, his Garmin, his drone, gone beneath fresh snow. And once again, whatever had been buried by the first avalanche was buried deeper by the second. Eventually, the search became way too dangerous. Broad Peak was still moving, still shedding snow, still threatening anyone who entered the debris. Down in Hunza, Sohail's family stopped waiting for a miracle. They held funeral prayers without his body. Hundreds came to Aliabad. His mother became so overwhelmed by grief and stress that she reportedly required medical treatment. They prayed for a son who was somewhere on a mountain, but nobody could tell them exactly where. And then, August 13, 3 local men from Tisar in Shigar were moving through the lower slopes of Broad Peak. Muhammad Nadeem, Muhammad Bashir, and Abuzar Ali. They weren't part of some enormous new expedition. They hadn't arrived with sophisticated search equipment. They kept looking. For almost 2 weeks, the avalanche debris had been changing. Sun during the day, freezing temperatures at night. Snow compacting, sections were melting, other sections shifting and settling. The surface that existed on July 30th was no longer exactly the same surface on August 13th. And somewhere around 5,600 meters, something had appeared. A boot. A mountaineering boot, protruding from the snow. The men stopped. They began digging. One shovel. Snow. Ice. More snow. Hours passed, and slowly the mountain revealed what had been underneath. It was Sohail Sakhi. Here is a video interview of the young man who found the body.
Before I translate the video, you have to understand about Abuzar Ali. That you already mentioned that he's from Tisar Shigar. He is a porter. He's not a mountain climber. He's not a mountaineer, or he's not even a guide. He is a porter.
Yeah.
This is very important note. And also very important note that he was not wearing any crampons, any other equipment to climb a mountain. They are wearing very normal shoes. And what he said in the mountain, I'm going to translate as he is saying, and at times the words are not, they cannot be translated into English, but I'm going to tell you the essence of it, but as close as possible to what he is saying.
Absolutely.
But mostly I will translate what he is saying. So here we go. So the person who's asking him that, where are you from? He tells me that he's from Tisar Shigar.
तीसर से इनका ताल्लुक, और ये वो लड़का है जिसने सोहेल भाई का जो डेड बॉडी है उसको रिकवर करने में इसका.
So the person who's asking is asking that this is that person that has the major role in recovering the body of Sohail.
बड़ा इम्पोर्टेंट रोल है. तो वो अब अबूजर भाई जो है वो अपने एज अ आई विटनेस सारा स्टोरी आप लोगों के सामने जो है ना वो सबके साथ शेयर करेगा. जी बताइए.
So as an eyewitness of when he was there, he discovered the body, he's going to share from now on. Okay. This is what Abuzar has to say.
हम ऊपर वो ब्रॉड पीक पे गया था ना वो बोझ लेके फिर हाँ हम
I went to Broad Peak and I was carrying a load. He went to the Broad Peak and he was carrying a load. What that tells you that he is a porter.
Porter. Yep.
उधर से वो बेस कैंप से ब्रॉड पीक बेस कैंप से थोड़ा सा ऊपर गया उधर वो जो पिछले एक्सीडेंट हुआ था उधर बर्फ आया था ना उसको देखा उधर थोड़ा सा
So I went from Broad Peak a little bit higher on the mountain, and whatever incident happened recently on Broad Peak, I wanted to go see.
From the base camp.
From the base camp.
सामान पड़ा हुआ था हमने जाके ऊपर थोड़ा सा ऊपर गया तो देखा किसी का वो बूट निकला हुआ था
So there was a little bit of belongings scattered, and as I went a little bit higher and I saw there was a boot in the mountain.
फिर हमने उसको खुदाई किया
Then I dug.
क्या पता इधर किसी का लाश हो या कोई और चीज हो फिर हमने खुदाई करके ना उधर देखा उधर किसी का लाश था सच में
Then I dug and wanted to see if who knows that there is someone's dead body there, and I dug and I saw that there was a dead body there.
फिर 3 घंटे हमने उधर काम किया हमारे पास कोई भी सामान नहीं था
So we worked there for 3 hours and we did not have any equipment on us except
फिर वो स्नोबॉल था उसी से हमने खोदा 3 घंटे के बाद हम
we just had one shovel. With that shovel we dug for 3 hours.
निकला लेकिन उसका जो लाश था उसका सर सही तरह से खराब हुआ था ना वो
After 3 hours we dug him out, but his head was not looking great. It was, I cannot translate in English, but he's saying
Well, it's not all there. It was in parts
That's right.
and mangled. Yeah.
That's right, mangled.
फिर हमने उसको जोड़ा थोड़ा
फेस
सा
खराब- फेस भी खराब था।
वो जिल बिल को जोड़ा तो मालूम हुआ ये सुहेल साकी ही है
Then I put it together, the head, and saw that it is Sohail Sakhi, but still.
हम नीचे आ गया ऊपर से नीचे आ गया हम वो ब्रिकाट के बोझ लेके गया था उधर उसका वो जो गाइड था वो अमानुल्लाह था फिर हमने नीचे आके बेस कैंप से अमानुल्लाह को फिर से शिनाख्त के लिए
So when I came down the mountain and the company I went with to do the porter's job, the guide was Amanullah, and he was looking for Amanullah and asking him to go identify. So he took him there for identification.
Okay.
शिनाख्त के लिए
दोबारा लेके गया
दोबारा लेके गया
तो उसने किया
फिर उसने कहा ये यही सुहेल साकी है फिर हमने उधर से उसको उठा के ना उसको थोड़ा सा वो त्रापाल में लपेट कर लेके नीचे आ गया
He said then he identified him as Sohail Sakhi, and we wrapped him in, we call it trapal over there. It's blue colored
The tarp.
tarp,
Yeah.
that what they wrap.
फिर नीचे सेव किया हुआ है
ठीक हो गया ओके थैंक यू
Now we have saved him under the snow. That's about it.
Thank you for that translation. 13 days after Broad Peak took him, 3 local men found him because a boot had finally appeared through the avalanche debris. But this story doesn't end there, because 2 climbers from Broad Peak still have not completely come home. One is Mallory Geis. Part of her remains were recovered, but the rest of her has never been located. The other is different. His name is Nawang Thendu Sherpa. And Noang isn't missing. They know where he is. His friends have seen his body. They climbed directly toward him. They carried more than 1,000 feet of rope into an active avalanche path. They climbed until the rope ran out. Then they came down, found more rope, and climbed again. They got closer. Then another avalanche came directly at them. It hit both rescuers. Somehow they survived. Noang remained above, and here's the cruelest part. Before Broad Peak, Noang had reportedly risked himself to bring other dead climbers home. On Annapurna, he searched an avalanche field for missing Sherpas. On Makalu, he climbed above 7,000 meters to help retrieve the body of a dead Czech mountaineer. Then Broad Peak killed Noang. And suddenly, he became the man others couldn't bring down. Tonight, we're going to tell you 2 interconnected stories. The man Broad Peak finally gave back, and the rescuer it still refuses to release. Before we go any further, let's briefly remember what happened. On July 30th, 2026, 10 climbers were moving high on Broad Peak when an avalanche swept through their group. 10 people died. There were no survivors, and we've already told that story in detail, so I don't want to spend this episode reconstructing every minute of the avalanche again. But there was a moment felt across the mountaineering community and far beyond it when people still allowed themselves to hope. Hope that somewhere beneath that snow, somehow, someone might still be alive. That against every calculation, every terrible probability, the impossible might still happen. Because almost immediately the tragedy had begun turning into numbers. 10 missing, then bodies found. Some recovered, others still unaccounted for. 7 brought down, 3 remaining, then another found. Another number changed. It became strangely clinical after a while. The arithmetic of death. Add 1 recovered body, subtract 1 missing climber, change the headline, change the number, and yet beneath that arithmetic, people were still hoping for that one number that would have changed everything. 1 survivor. Maybe that's because as human beings, we're constantly drawn toward the possibility that the impossible might not actually be impossible. It's the same idea behind Project Possible. That sometimes what looks impossible today is simply something that hasn't been achieved yet. And for a little while, people desperately wanted to believe that survival could be one of those impossible things. It wasn't. But what happened afterward would reveal something else about human beings. Because while the arithmetic of death told us how many people were gone, it told us absolutely nothing about who they were. And that's where this story really begins. But before we get there, I know what some of you might be thinking, and maybe you've even written it underneath one of our previous videos. Why should we care? They chose to climb the mountain. Nobody forced them to go there. They knew it was dangerous. Maybe they shouldn't have been there in the first place. And I actually understand that reaction. Well, if you've never felt the pull of a mountain, standing at sea level, looking at an avalanche and 10 dead people, it can seem completely irrational. Why deliberately walk toward danger? Why spend thousands of dollars and months training, weeks freezing, risking frostbite, avalanches, and death, just to stand somewhere for a few minutes, take a photograph, and come down? It's a fair question, but I think it misses something very important about human beings. We are strange creatures. For some reason, we are constantly drawn toward the edges of what we think we're capable of. We run faster, we climb higher, we sail further, we explore places where there's absolutely no practical reason for us to be. We invent goals and then suffer enormously trying to achieve them. And we've been doing that for as long as human beings have been telling stories. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Think about that for a moment. The obstacle isn't always something interrupting your journey. Sometimes the obstacle is the journey, and you don't have to climb Broad Peak to understand that. Maybe your mountain is trying to rebuild your life after losing somebody. Maybe it's starting again after a relationship collapses. Maybe you're battling your own confidence. Maybe you're trying to build a business while everyone around you thinks you're crazy. Maybe you're an athlete who spent years chasing a time, finally achieves it, and wakes up the next morning realizing, now I need another goal. Because that's what athletes do. You run 47 seconds and suddenly you want 46. You run a marathon and immediately begin wondering whether you could run it faster. You win one competition and after the celebration ends, you have to reinvent the challenge. Not because the previous achievement meant nothing, because human beings need something ahead of us. Something that asks, what else are you capable of?
Well, when you mentioned 46 and 47 seconds, I believe you're talking about men's 400 meters.
Yes, I am.
Yeah, not a marathon. So just to clarify, because a lot of people might know about running.
Yes.
So, and I think that's the part people misunderstand about climbers. The summit isn't really useful in the ordinary sense. Nobody's life becomes easier because they stood on top of Broad Peak or Everest.
Exactly. There is no supermarket up there, no treasure, no promotion waiting on the summit. The reward is internal. It's discovering that you can control yourself when every part of your body is asking you to stop. that you can remain focused when you're exhausted. That fear doesn't always have to make the decision for you. Eventually, you turn around and realize you've crossed something you once believed you couldn't. That's why these stories matter. Not because everyone watching this should climb an 8,000-meter mountain. Please don't misunderstand me. Most of us never will, nor feel compelled in any way to do so. But we recognize something of ourselves in people who attempt extraordinary things. Their stories allow us to borrow perspective. Sometimes you're having the worst year of your life and you hear about somebody enduring something almost unimaginable. And somehow your own problem becomes a little easier to carry. Not because their suffering cancels yours. It doesn't. But because another human being has demonstrated something useful. People can endure more than they think they can. People can adapt. People can fail, come back, fail again, and still continue. And sometimes that's exactly the story you need to hear when your own life feels stuck. And there is another side of mountaineering that gets forgotten. Not everyone standing on these summits could have reached them alone. That's the truth. Some climbers have enormous experience. Some are extraordinarily gifted. Some clients would never safely reach these places without professional guides, Sherpas, high-altitude workers, and teammates beside them. But that doesn't make the experience meaningless. It's quite the opposite. That's what a guide does. A great coach does something similar for an athlete. A coach cannot run the race for you, but the coach can give you access to a version of yourself you may never have discovered alone. A mountain guide cannot breathe for a client, cannot make the client's legs move, cannot eliminate fear, but the guide can provide experience, judgment, rope, oxygen, even route knowledge, maybe even tie the knots for you or even move the carabiners for you, and sometimes simply the confidence to take one more step. And because of that, people who might never otherwise experience the great mountains get to experience something extraordinary. They get a glimpse of what mountains do to people. And I don't mean spiritually, in some supernatural sense.
Oh, there is definitely a supernatural aura there.
Oh, I agree. But what I mean is just simply what happens when the noise of ordinary life disappears. No emails, no bills, no arguments on social media, no 100 little distractions pulling your mind in different directions up there. And life becomes brutally simple. You breathe, you step, you check the rope, you watch the weather, you keep moving, you stay alive, and you help the person beside you. There is something almost cleansing about that simplicity. A mountain forces focus upon you. It exposes impatience. It exposes ego. It exposes whether you panic when plans collapse. It teaches you very quickly that nature does not negotiate with your schedule, your reputation, your money, or your ambition. And those are lessons that don't necessarily remain on the mountain. They come back down with you.
So when somebody says they shouldn't have gone there, maybe that's true from one point of view. They could have stayed home, or they should have turned back at least.
Of course they could, and perhaps they would still be alive. We can't escape that. But if the only objective of human life were to eliminate every unnecessary risk, we would live extraordinarily small lives. Nobody would race a motorcycle, nobody would cross an ocean alone, nobody would attempt a world record, and nobody would explore caves. Nobody would become an astronaut, nobody would run until their lungs burned simply because a clock was measuring them. And most importantly, we would lose many of the stories that teach the rest of us what determination actually looks like. That doesn't mean every risk is intelligent. It doesn't make poor decisions heroic. And it certainly doesn't mean death is somehow a worthy price for a summit. It means something much simpler. The desire to test ourselves is deeply human. And these people tested themselves in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Some were chasing personal limits. Some were earning a living. And some were guiding other people's dreams. And when things went terribly wrong, other human beings turned around and went back into the same danger to bring them home. That's where tonight's story really begins. Because the most extraordinary part of Broad Peak may not be that 10 people went up. It may be what happened when everyone else realized somebody had to go back.
Yep.
One of those missing men was Sohail Sakhi. For almost 2 weeks, they couldn't find him. 3 local men noticed something emerging from the avalanche debris. a boot, and underneath it was the man an entire mountain had been hiding.
The part that's difficult to understand is that they found his tracker. So how can the person be somewhere else?
Because an avalanche doesn't transport a person intact. It dismantles the scene, the backpack, ice axe, tracker, body, the gloves, helmet, everything can separate. Imagine being inside something moving faster than you can run, made of thousands of tons of snow, accelerating down a mountain. The climber isn't choosing a direction. Gravity is. The Broad Peak avalanche struck the ground around 6,600 meters between camps 2 and 3. Sohail would eventually be discovered around 5,600 meters, roughly a vertical kilometer lower. That doesn't mean he traveled in a straight line for 1 kilometer. Avalanches funnel. They bounce off terrain. They enter gullies. Bodies can stop while equipment continues, and equipment can stop while the bodies continue. So when rescuers found Sohail's backpack and tracker, they had found evidence of his path, not necessarily Sohail. And that became one of the most frustrating clues on the mountain. His equipment was there, but he wasn't. One of the people who refused to give up easily was Pakistani climber Abid Beg. Sohail wasn't simply another climber Abid had met in base camp. They quickly became close friends. And there's an enormous difference between searching for a missing person and searching for somebody whose voice you know, somebody you've eaten with, somebody you've laughed with, somebody whose family you know. Abid and Sirbaz Khan entered the debris. They were his friends. Think about what that means. The avalanche had already killed 10 people. The snowpack was still unstable. Anyone would turn back. Fresh avalanches were continuing, and these men deliberately walked into the exact kind of terrain that had just killed their friends. They searched. Then they heard something, a sound every mountaineer recognizes instantly. Movement above. Another avalanche.
And they're standing in the debris field of the first one.
Exactly. Then they ran. Abid and Sirbaz made it toward the rocks. The avalanche swept through, but they survived. But the original debris field was actually buried again. Imagine looking at the place where you believe your friend may be and watching another layer of mountain fall over it. Abid's own backpack was caught, his phone, his Garmin, his drone, all gone. So now the search area was deeper, more chaotic, more dangerous. It had effectively been reset. And this is where recovery operations enter a brutal moral territory. How many living climbers should be exposed to the same slope for somebody who has already died?
Yeah.
From the comfort of our home, the answer feels simple. Keep searching. Bring him back. Never leave anyone behind. Those phrases sound noble, but someone has to physically perform them. Someone has to stand underneath unstable snow. Somebody has to cross the avalanche path. Someone has children waiting for them too. The rescuers had already been nearly hit, and eventually the organized search was suspended. Not because people stopped caring, because Broad Peak was sending a very clear warning. Every additional hour on the debris field could create another victim. Abid and Sirbaz still hoped to return later. They talked about coming back after the mountain had changed later in the season, perhaps after more snow had settled or melted, perhaps when the debris became easier to read, perhaps when the mountain stopped moving so violently. They expected that might take weeks, maybe until September, but 13 days after the accident, something on the lower mountain changed first. Muhammad Nadim, Muhammad Bashir, Abuzar Ali, remember those names, because in stories about 8,000-meter peaks, there's a tendency to remember famous climbers and forget almost everybody else. But the people who actually make these mountains function are often local porters, cooks, high-altitude workers, fixers, guides, men carrying supplies, people who know glaciers not because they watched a documentary, but because they have spent years walking across them. These 3 men came from Tisar in Shigar. They continued looking for Sohail on their own initiative. He was his people. No television cameras following them, no enormous rescue announcement. They were simply on the lower mountain, where snow and avalanche debris had been sitting for nearly 2 weeks. And avalanche debris doesn't remain frozen in one perfect configuration forever. It settles, it compresses, snow bridges collapse, edges soften in daytime warmth, water moves, and then the ice shifts. Winds uncover one area and covers the other. The mountain was slowly reorganizing debris, and somewhere around Camp 1, something that had previously been hidden became visible. I keep coming back to the simplicity of that image, a boot. After the GPS trackers and the drones, professional climbers, and helicopter flights, and after the rescue teams did what they were doing and failed, the thing that finally led people to Sohail was a boot sticking through the snow. The men began digging. Avalanche snow is not fluffy powder. Once compressed, refrozen, and mixed with ice, it can become almost concrete. Concrete, guys. So they worked, carried large shovels, and shoveled into snow, lift, throw, again and again. Hours passed. They continued until underneath the avalanche debris, a human form began to emerge. And then the question nobody wanted to ask became obvious. Was it him? They couldn't verify at first it was him because his body was in parts. His face had been separated and all over the place. They called for help. Other volunteers joined them. Their leader and cook, Zaman, helped with the recovery. This went on for more than 3 hours, digging and looking. The final identification confirmed it. The mountain had finally given them Sohail Sakhi. So right now, his body will have to be stored on the glacier with broken ice surrounding him to keep him frozen so it doesn't start to decompose before they can do their investigations.
After his family had already held his funeral.
Yes, that's what makes the timing so painful. They had already said goodbye without him. And now it's such a terrible shape they would see him.
That must have been so horrifying for the rescuers to have to strap all the remains up just to be able to transport him down.
Oh, I can't even imagine what they were thinking at that time. And this is where I don't want the story to become only Pakistani climber found dead, because Sohail's life is much stranger and much more interesting than actually the way that it ended. Sohail Sakhi came from Aliabad in Hunza, a young, educated, curious, and even before the mountains became his profession, he studied pure mathematics. I love that detail because most people imagine mountaineers as purely physical people, strong legs, strong lungs, risk tolerance. But Sohail's mind had originally gone toward abstraction, numbers, patterns, proof, and at some point he realized that mountains scratched the same part of his brain. He once connected mathematics and mountains through the idea of abstraction, and that actually makes sense. A mountain guide spends his life looking at invisible relationships. For instance, temperature versus snow stability, wind versus slope, just to name a couple. But a man from Hunza Valley had a chance to represent what Hunza people really are. Tell us a little bit about the Hunza Valley.
Well, Hunza people have a very strong identity of their own that predates Pakistan by centuries. If you know, the Pakistan is only, actually coincidence. This is 14th of August there.
Yep.
Actually, it's 15th now. We have 14th here and Pacific Standard Time. It is their Independence Day from British. When British left, they left two countries behind. One is the oldest civilization, India, and then Pakistan was carved out of it. And Pakistan, late after the independence and whatever area was given to them, and then Kashmir was in itself an independent state, and then they joined India, but it was too late for them to join until Pakistan had already attacked and taken over this Baltistan region.
Right.
That's where Hunza people are. So culturally and ethnically, it is more often accurate to describe someone as Hunzakut, Burusho, Waki, or from Hunza rather than flattening everyone into Pakistani. But administratively today, Hunza is in Hunza district of Gilgit, Baltistan, a territory administered by Pakistan. And its residents generally function under Pakistani nationality documentation because Pakistan is occupied territory.
Right.
Gilgit-Baltistan itself is not an ordinary Pakistani province. It's important to note here, and for most of the mountaineering community that goes over there, we say we're going to Pakistan because you have to take the Islamabad airport and go to Gilgit-Baltistan. So most people are not familiar with the history, but it is actually not Pakistan. Its constitutional and political status is unusual and tied to the wider Kashmir dispute. Kashmir is actually the state in India. So it's very important to note this part.
Right. So it would be more accurate to say Sohail Sakhi came from Aliabad in the Hunza Valley of Gilgit, Baltistan, a mountain society with an identity far older than modern Pakistan. There definitely is a lot going on geopolitically in the wider Kashmir area. And honestly, despite all of that, Sohail wasn't simply guiding trekking groups. He became a serious high-altitude climber. K2, Nanga Parbat, Gasherbrum 1, Gasherbrum 2, Kanchenjunga, and several of those enormous peaks without supplemental oxygen. And in the 2025 Pakistani season alone, he climbed Nanga Parbat and K2 without bottled oxygen. That put him in a very different category. He wasn't simply surviving at altitude. He was developing into one of Gilgit Baltistan's stronger high-altitude professionals. It's fitting because he is the mountain people, and yet one Pakistan 8,000er remained. Broad Peak was unfinished business, and perhaps if this were a heroic film, you would expect Broad Peak to become the final triumph. The missing mountain, the last giant in Gilgit, Baltistan. Instead, it became the final mountain of his life. But Sohail's ambitions weren't limited to climbing. He founded a company called Moving Mountains, and even the name tells you something. He didn't only want to climb mountains, he wanted to move the system around them. For years, international expeditions had come into Pakistan. Foreign climbers, foreign operators, foreign guides. Local Pakistani workers did some of the hardest jobs, often while remaining almost invisible internationally. Sohail believed the Gilgit-Baltistan climbers could be more than manpower. They could lead, own companies, guide international clients, and train younger people, build a professional climbing culture from the Hunza itself. He helped create opportunities for young boys and girls to climb. He wanted the next generation to think beyond carrying bags. A young person from Hunza could look at mountaineering and think, maybe I can become a guide. Maybe I can become an expedition leader. Maybe I can own the company. Maybe the mountains around me don't only belong to the people flying from somewhere else. This is important because that area actually isn't being taken care of by Pakistan and the government. So they're kind of on their own. The Hunza Valley people are on their own to create their own economy, to create their own jobs and livelihood. And then Sohail began talking about something that now feels painfully prophetic, the mountain rescue. In 2025, Sohail spoke openly about rescue problems in the Karakoram, and his words hit differently. He said, "We have no infrastructure, and rescue is often very expensive and nearly impossible." That's not a quote spoken after Broad Peak. He said it before he disappeared, before people searched for him, and before another avalanche nearly killed Abid, before the operation had to be suspended, before 3 local men eventually found him with a shovel, and honestly just by chance. Sohail believed Pakistan needed a stronger, organized mountain rescue system, not rescue dependent entirely on who happens to be available. Not a system where every emergency requires extraordinary improvisation, something permanent and something funded, and something professional. A system capable of supporting rope fixing, search, recovery, and high-altitude emergencies.
And he had experience with this before.
He did. This wasn't an academic opinion. He had already carried the consequences. In 2025, Sohail's friend, Iftikhar Hussain, died in a snow and rock avalanche. Sohail helped bring his body down. He also participated in helping an injured mountain worker that same season. So when Sohail spoke about rescue being almost impossible, he knew exactly what impossible felt like. He had stood beside somebody who could no longer walk. He had helped move a dead climber. And anyone who has participated in mountain recovery will tell you something important. A body at altitude becomes one of the most difficult things human beings ever move. A living person can balance, step, push, hold rope. A deceased person cannot. Every kilogram has to be controlled by somebody else. On steep terrain, gravity wants the body to go down faster than you do. So rescuers fight gravity while exhausted, inside thin air, sometimes while still exposed to whatever killed the person they're carrying. Sohail knew that, and he had been the rescuer before. Less than a year later, somebody else had to become his. Days passed after Broad Peak, and Sohail's family entered one of the most difficult spaces grief can create. No body, no grave, no final moment. Just reports. Maybe today, maybe tomorrow, if the weather persists or permits, Avalanches permit, search is now suspended, search may resume, a backpack found, a tracker found, and nothing else. Eventually, his family accepted what had happened. Funeral prayers were held in Aliabad. Hundreds came. Think about what that means culturally and emotionally. You are performing the rites of death, while some part of your mind still knows the body is physically somewhere else. Sohail's mother reportedly became so distressed that she fainted and she needed medical treatment. That is when Broad Peak stops being an adventure story. It's no longer snow and crampons and summits. It's a mother in a hospital and a family praying beside an empty space. And it reminds me of something Osho once said. Life and death are almost like two wings. Maybe that's the part we struggle to accept. We spend our entire lives treating death as though it belongs somewhere else, somewhere far away from living. But the two have always traveled together. Every beginning carries an ending, and every arrival eventually carries a goodbye. And perhaps that's why bringing somebody home matters so much. You cannot reverse the death. You cannot complete the circle by bringing them back to life. But sometimes you can complete the journey. And for Sohail's family, that journey was still unfinished. They had already prayed for him. They had already accepted that he was gone. But somewhere high in Broad Peak, their son was still waiting to come home. Then, on August 13th, they dig. The body comes out. And after 13 days, Sohail is no longer missing. He's brought down to base camp. And from there, the next stage is the helicopter evacuation towards Skardu. And eventually, he can make his way home. Nothing about this is a happy ending. Sohail is still dead. His mother doesn't get her son back alive. Moving Mountains doesn't get its founder back, and his friends don't get another expedition. But there is a difference between grief with a place and grief without one. There is a difference between saying my son is somewhere on Broad Peak and saying my son finally came home. And that difference is what the three men from Shigar gave Sohail's family. Now, two people only remain, incompletely recovered, Mallory Geis and Nawang Thendu Sherpa. Mallory remains somewhere in the avalanche zone. A detached leg was recovered and identified, but the rest of her remains have not been located. Nawang's situation is completely different. His body has been seen, his position is known, and somehow that may be even more painful because his friends know exactly where he is. They simply can't reach him safely. Noang Tindu Sherpa came from Makalu region of the eastern Nepal. He's from a mountain family. His father climbed. 3 of his brothers climbed mountains above 8,000 meters. The high mountains were not some distant dream in Nawang's world. They were family history, work, tradition, identity. And he was still young, only in his late 20s, unmarried, working with 7 Summits Trek. And his own 8,000-meter resume was already quickly growing. Everest, Lhotse, Mountsalu, Kanchenjunga, Makalu, a young guide moving upward. But if you really want to understand Nawang, don't look only at the summits. Look at the times he went back up for somebody else. April 7th, 2025, Annapurna, a 7th Summits Trek team was working above Camp 2. Oxygen cylinders were being ferried upward, then an avalanche released. 2 Sherpa guides disappeared. Ngima Tashi Sherpa and Rima Rinje Sherpa. A third man, Pemba Tanduk Sherpa, was swept, but managed to stop himself. And then something happened that rarely gets into glamorous expedition videos. Instead of continuing toward a summit, people began searching for their friends. 4 Sherpas joined Pemba. One of them was Nawang. They went into the avalanche debris looking, probing, searching, trying to find 2 men beneath a mountain of snow. Eventually, the snow won. The bodies could not be safely recovered. Nawang returned from Annapurna without them. A year later, his friends would face exactly the same decision with him. Imagine that. Then came May 2026, only weeks before Broad Peak. Czech climber David Rubinek died high on Makalu 2, around 7,300 meters. At that altitude, simply existing is work. Sleeping is difficult, eating is difficult, thinking becomes slower. Every movement is expensive, and a 5-man recovery team went up. Nawang was one of them. They reached David, and they began bringing his body down from roughly 7,300 meters towards a high camp around 6,100 meters. That's approximately 1,200 vertical meters with a dead man in bad weather. This wasn't a rescue for headlines, no summit, no flag, no celebration, just 5 mountain workers doing something brutally difficult because a family far away deserved to receive their loved one.
And that's only 2 months before Nawang dies himself.
Exactly. That's why this story hurts. July 30th, Broad Peak, the avalanche hits, Nawang disappears. Over the following days, drones and rescuers began finding the victims. Most bodies are swept lower, but one body appears separated from the others, higher inside a steep avalanche chute. The position of the tracker and the missing climbers, the equipment already found, everything points towards Nawang. And now the man who had gone up for other people's bodies needed someone to go up for his. 2 climbers volunteered, Dorje Sherpa and Speed Dawa Sherpa. Speed Dawa came from Nawang's home region. This was not simply an assignment. This was personal. He was his friend and extended family. Those men are heroes for attempting this. They couldn't simply follow the normal Broad Peak route. Nawang wasn't lying conveniently beside it. He had been thrown into a terrain below an avalanche path. It was steep, all broken up, and dangerous. So Dorje, by the way, he actually got married to his wife on the summit of Everest.
Wow. Now that is taking a destination wedding to another level.
Oh, totally.
Who is invited there?
Wow. Just the ones who are summiting. Speed, Dawa, and Pem entered the chute directly. The amount of skill required to attempt this is unfathomable. They carried approximately 1,000 feet of rope. Picture that. 1,000 feet. More than 3 football fields of rope. They climbed, kicked steps, fixed lines, moved higher, and eventually the rope ended. Nawang was still above them. They were almost there. They looked upward and realized they couldn't reach him. So they came down. And if this were simply a professional recovery operation, maybe that would have been the end. But this simply wasn't just a job. It was their friend, their brother. They found more rope, approximately 350 additional feet, and they went back. They headed for the same avalanche path on the second attempt. More rope, more exposure. They climbed again. Eventually, they reached a heavily crevassed section beneath one overhang. And then, for the second time, they reached the end of the rope. Oh my goodness. The feeling of despair they must have felt. Kind of like leaving the battleground when you've lost the war. And still Nawang remained above them, roughly 450 feet away. Just 450 feet. When you say it at home, it sounds almost close, a city block, a short walk. But on Broad Peak, 450 feet can be the distance between life and death. It also takes forever to climb up or down. They had no more rope. The terrain above them was steep, and the body would have to be secured, moved, then lowered, and controlled through an overhang, all while rescuers remained underneath active avalanche terrain. And then the mountain moved again. They heard it, snow breaking above. The sound builds so quickly that it comes down the chute, directly at them. Dorje and Speed Dawa are hit. Snow surrounds them, engulfs them, and for a moment, the men trying to recover a Broad Peak victim become potential Broad Peak victims themselves. Somehow, both survive. And after you've just been hit by an avalanche, the mathematics of loyalty changes. Because above you, your friend is dead. Below you, your family is alive. What do you owe each? There is no beautiful answer. Dorje eventually summarized this decision in one sentence. We didn't want there to be another 2 bodies on the mountain. So they turned around, and Nawang remained above.
I think it was the best decision.
Yes, we celebrate rescuers who keep going. Sometimes we should celebrate the ones who know when to stop. Courage isn't about climbing higher. Sometimes courage is looking at somebody you desperately want to bring home and admitting, if I continue, my children may lose their father too. Dorje and Speed Dawa had already tried twice. They've given it their all. They had carried roughly 1,350 feet of rope. These guys are superhuman. They had climbed into the path that killed their friend. An avalanche had already hit them, and Nawang was still hundreds of feet away. Later, an even larger avalanche swept through the same area. Had they still been there, they may have died. That's a terrible truth. Turning around may have saved their lives, but now since the tracker is not on Nawang, he may be in a different position due to the continuous avalanches.
And if you want to understand just how unstable Broad Peak remained, consider what happened during another part of the recovery. Rescuers had recovered several bodies from the lower mountain. Nirmal Purja, Kili Pemba Sherpa, Wangjong, Dayalu Sherpa, they began moving them downward. Fresh snow continued to fall.
Yeah.
Conditions deteriorated. Mingmaji made the decision to pull the recovery team back. About an hour later, another major avalanche came through. One body was thrown dramatically farther down the mountain.
Oh my goodness. That was a really smart call, don't you think? Right in the nick of time.
Yep.
And the 3 others disappeared beneath the debris again. Think about that. These rescuers had already recovered the dead, and then Broad Peak buried them again. So they went back and dug them out again. That's what people mean when they say the bodies were recovered. Behind those 4 simple words, there may be days of risk, multiple avalanches, hundreds of meters of rope, and exhausted people refusing to leave somebody behind. Noang remains somewhere above 6,000 meters in terrain exposed to avalanche paths from multiple directions. There's steep ground, crevices, an overhang, and most importantly, a body that cannot assist in its own descent. Speed Dawa had explained that forcing the recovery during those conditions could have killed the entire team. So Noang will remain not because nobody cares, not because nobody tried, not because they don't know where he is. They know. They come within hundreds of feet. They simply reach the boundary where loyalty ends. And survival has to begin. And now, look at Noang's story in order. Annapurna, 2 Sherpas disappear beneath an avalanche. Noang enters the avalanche field looking for them. He cannot bring them home. May 2026, David Rubinek dies at roughly 7,300 meters on Makalu 2. Noang climbs up, helps reach him, and helps bring him down 1,200 vertical meters. July 2026, Noang dies in an avalanche on Broad Peak. 2 of his friends climb toward him twice. They run out of rope, they return with more, they are hit by another avalanche, and eventually they have to leave him.
It's almost the same story he lived on Annapurna, except now he's the person in the snow.
Exactly. That's the symmetry that makes it so painful. The rescuer becomes the unrecovered.
Will they try again?
Well, future recovery is still possible, so Noang may not remain there forever, but everything depends on what happens to the mountain. There's been recent stories of certain bodies that have finally come down the mountain 9 months later. There was also the story of Climber Low and that tragic loss where he was found, he was lost on the mountain and then he was found almost 17 years later because the mountain finally brought him down.
Yeah.
So everything depends on what happens to the mountain. If his body remains in roughly the same position, a future team could arrive better prepared, more rope, more climbers, more stable weather, a carefully planned system for lowering him through the steep section, perhaps later, perhaps next season. But there is another possibility. Avalanches continue, snow moves, and a body sitting in unstable terrain can move too. Another avalanche could carry Noang further down and bury him, moving into a crevasse, or make him impossible to locate again. So his family lives with a strange reality. They know where he is today. They don't know whether he will still be there tomorrow.
And there is another reason bringing Nawang home matters.
Yes, this simply isn't about recovering the body for the sake of saying the operation succeeded. Noang came from a Sherpa Buddhist family. In Sherpa tradition, death begins another journey. Lamas pray for the deceased. There are ceremonies intended to guide consciousness through what Tibetan Buddhism calls the bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth. You can tell us more about that.
Yeah, bardo. It's like Hindus. They believe there is
reincarnation,
but in between there is this space that you live in the meantime,
right,
before you're born. More about that whenever we come to.
Yeah, so for as long as 49 days, families may continue prayers and offerings, but they don't need Noang's body to pray for him. They don't need his body to love him, and they don't need his body to remember him. But there are the things they cannot do while he remains on Broad Peak. They cannot receive their son. They cannot stand beside him one final time. They cannot perform the physical cremation they might otherwise choose according to their tradition. And they cannot gather around the remains of the young man who left home for Pakistan and complete that final journey with him and help his spirit move toward reincarnation.
So when we keep saying bring him home, we're not really talking about the geography.
Exactly. Home isn't just Kathmandu. Home is simply getting him across the border. It means returning Noang to the people who knew him before any of us knew his name, his family, his village, his community, and allowing them to say goodbye in their own way. Remember the cruel irony. Noang had already gone onto Annapurna looking for 2 Sherpas who couldn't be brought home. Then only months before his death, he helped bring David Rubinak's body down approximately 1,200 vertical meters from Makalu 2. He understood what recovering the dead body meant. He had done it for someone else's family, and now his own family is waiting for someone to do it for him. And then there is Mallory Geis. Her situation remains different. Part of her remains were recovered early in the operation, but her remaining body has not been found. Her family cannot truly find closure until she is brought home, until they can see her one final time and perform her funeral rites and say goodbye that the mountain has so far denied them. They may have to organize a recovery operation themselves. So Broad Peak now holds two very different mysteries: Mallory somewhere and Noang visible but unreachable. One requires a search, the other requires a recovery operation so dangerous that the rescuers themselves nearly became victims. So people say, bring them home. It's one of the most natural things a family can ask, and one of the most complicated things a mountain can demand. Bring them home may mean climbing 6,000 meters, entering the avalanche path that killed them, digging through refrozen debris, building anchors, carrying hundreds of meters of rope, securing a body, dragging it, lowering it, lifting it around crevasses, waiting for weather, calling helicopters, dealing with altitude, then reaching base camp, then Skardu, and then a hospital, then paperwork, then an embassy, then an international flight. 5 words. Bring our loved ones home, which has entire expedition hidden inside them.
Do you think Sohail's death will actually change rescue in Pakistan?
It should at least keep the conversation alive, because Sohail described the problem before becoming a part of it. He wasn't criticizing from a distance. He was the Pakistani climber working inside the Karakoram. He saw how much rescue depended on extraordinary individuals: army helicopters, local climbers, friends, porters, volunteers, people improvising, and Broad Peak demonstrated both the strength and weaknesses of that system. The strength kept going back. The people kept going back again and again. The weakness, so much dependent on people being heroic. Sohail wanted something more systematic: a professional rescue structure, funding, training, organization, a system where heroism helps. But heroism isn't the entire plan. Noang's story actually teaches us the other half. Even the best rescue system cannot eliminate the mountain. Technology has limits. Helicopters have limits. Rope has limits. People have limits. You can carry 1,350 feet of rope and still be 450 feet short. You can know exactly where the body is and still be unable to reach it. You can be the strongest climber on the mountain and still have an avalanche tell you no further. Human beings like stories where bravery defeats everything. Mountains don't work that way. Sometimes bravery reaches physics, and physics wins. We often describe mountains as cruel, but Broad Peak isn't cruel. Cruelty requires intention. The mountains didn't know Sohail studied mathematics. It didn't know he founded moving mountains. It didn't know his mother was waiting in Hunza. It didn't know Noang had recovered bodies before. It didn't know Nirmal Purja was famous. It didn't know Kili had finished all 14 8,000ers. Snow releases because of gravity, temperature, wind, slope, structure. And maybe that's even harder to accept because there is nobody to argue with, nobody to blame, nobody who can say, I've taken enough. Only the living, arriving afterward, trying to repair what happened. And sometimes repairing it begins with something almost absurdly small: a boot. Think about all the ways Sohail might never have been found. Another snowfall, another avalanche 10 meters further left, a cloud shadow, a different route, a person looking down instead of across. Instead, somebody noticed, and because somebody noticed, 3 men stopped. And because they stopped, they dug. And because they dug, Sohail came out of the mountain after 13 days. The search reduced itself to one human detail: a boot in the snow, just by chance. There is a point where loyalty to the dead cannot require sacrificing the living.
And maybe one day somebody will reach Nawang.
I hope they do, but only when the person going up has a reasonable chance of coming back. Because Noang spent part of his life helping other families receive their dead, if there's anything we can infer from that, I don't think his final legacy should require 2 more families to lose theirs. Sohail Sakhi has finally been found, Nawang Thendu Sherpa remains on Broad Peak, and Mallory Geis remains only partially recovered. And the mountain is still changing. Snow is settling, monsoon season's here, ice is shifting, avalanche debris is moving. Eventually, Broad Peak may reveal more, or it may hide more. Nobody controls that part of the story now. But tonight, remember 2 images. One, a mountaineering boot slowly appearing through an old avalanche snow, 3 men stopping and digging and finding Sohail beneath it. And the other, 2 exhausted Sherpas standing at the end of approximately 1,350 feet of rope, looking upward, knowing their friend was still another 450 feet away. One distance, closed, the other still waiting. Sohail Sakhi, Nawang Tindu Sherpa, remember their names, but also remember the people who went back for them. because climbing a mountain takes courage. Sometimes going back up for someone who can no longer come down takes even more. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I'm Rima. This is Reimbach Arcane. We'll see you on the next story.